The courthouse was packed that Tuesday morning, but nobody expected what was about to happen. Karen strutted through those double doors like she owned the place, her arms loaded with 3 massive binders and that smug smile plastered across her face. She had been planning this moment for months, convinced she was about to deliver the legal victory of a lifetime. As the newly elected president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association, she had made it her personal mission to bring every single property in the neighborhood under her iron grip of control. She positioned herself at the plaintiff's table with theatrical precision, arranging her binders in perfect alignment and smoothing down her blazer. The confidence radiating from her was almost palpable as she glanced around the courtroom, clearly savoring what she believed would be her moment of triumph. Karen had spent weeks preparing her case, practicing her arguments in the mirror, and imagining the look of defeat on my face when the judge inevitably ruled in her favor. But as the judge entered the room and we all rose to our feet, Karen had no idea that her entire world was about to crumble in the span of 3 minutes. She had no clue that the single document I held in my hand would completely destroy everything she thought she knew about property law, homeowner associations, and the boundaries of her precious little kingdom. The smug smile that had been her trademark for months was about to vanish forever. When I handed that certified plat map to the judge, the entire atmosphere in the courtroom shifted like a sudden change in weather. The judge's eyebrows raised slightly as he examined the document, and I watched Karen's confident expression begin to waver. She leaned forward in her chair, straining to see what I had presented, but it was already too late. The judge glanced up at her with a look that could have frozen fire, and in that moment, Karen realized she had made the biggest mistake of her life. 3 minutes later, the case was dismissed with prejudice. Karen sat there in stunned silence, her mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air, as the judge delivered his ruling. Not only had she lost spectacularly, but she had also opened herself and the entire HOA board to potential legal consequences that would haunt them for years to come. The woman who had terrorized half the neighborhood with her power trips and legal threats had just been handed the most humiliating defeat imaginable. 6 months earlier, life had been completely different. I had just closed on my dream home, a beautiful 3-bedroom ranch situated on a quiet street in what I thought was the perfect neighborhood. The house had everything I had been searching for during my 2-year hunt for the right property. It featured a spacious backyard, mature oak trees providing natural shade, and most importantly, it was located outside any homeowner association boundaries. I had specifically sought out a property that would allow me the freedom to live my life without interference from overzealous neighbors or restrictive covenants. During the home buying process, I had been extremely careful to verify that the property was not subject to any HOA rules or regulations. My real estate agent had assured me multiple times that the house was in an unincorporated area, free from the constraints that plagued so many other neighborhoods. I had even requested copies of the property deed and plat maps to confirm this crucial detail before signing any contracts. The freedom to paint my house whatever color I wanted, plant whatever garden I desired, and park my vehicles wherever I chose was worth more to me than any amenity an HOA could provide. The first few weeks in my new home were absolutely perfect. I spent my mornings drinking coffee on the back patio, listening to the birds chirping in the oak trees and planning various improvement projects. The neighborhood was exactly what I had hoped for, quiet and peaceful, with neighbors who minded their own business and respected each other's privacy. I had finally found my slice of suburban paradise, or so I thought. Everything changed the day I met Karen. She appeared at my front door on a sunny Thursday afternoon, introducing herself as the president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. She was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and an outfit that looked like it had been purchased at an expensive boutique. But it was her eyes that caught my attention immediately, cold and calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. Karen informed me with barely concealed condescension that she was conducting a neighborhood welcome tour for new residents. She explained that while my property might technically be outside the current HOA boundaries, she expected all residents in the area to maintain certain standards of appearance and behavior. She handed me a thick packet of rules and regulations, along with a strongly worded suggestion that I consider joining the association voluntarily for the good of the entire community. I politely but firmly explained that I had specifically purchased my home because it was not part of any homeowner association. I had no intention of joining an organization that would restrict my property rights or impose monthly fees for services I did not want or need. Karen's smile became noticeably tighter as I spoke, and I could see the wheels turning in her head as she processed my refusal to comply with her expectations. From that day forward, Karen made it her personal mission to make my life as difficult as possible. It started with passive-aggressive notes left on my car windshield, criticizing everything from the height of my grass to the color of my mailbox. She would walk by my house multiple times a day, often stopping to take photographs of various aspects of my property with her phone. When I installed security cameras to document her bizarre behavior, she actually had the audacity to complain to the local police about my invasion of her privacy. The harassment escalated quickly from mere annoyance to outright persecution. Karen began leaving official-looking citations on my door, complete with letterhead from the Willowbrook HOA and references to various violations of community standards. She cited me for having a basketball hoop in my driveway, for parking my truck on the street instead of in my garage, and for planting sunflowers in my front yard without prior architectural approval. Each citation came with increasingly expensive fines and threats of legal action if I failed to comply immediately. I tried reasoning with Karen on several occasions, explaining that her HOA had no jurisdiction over my property and that her citations were legally meaningless. I showed her copies of my property deed and the original plat maps that clearly indicated my home was outside the association boundaries. But Karen was beyond reason at this point, driven by some twisted need to control every aspect of the neighborhood regardless of legal constraints or common sense. The situation reached a breaking point when Karen organized a special meeting of the HOA board to discuss what she called the problem of non-compliant properties in the extended neighborhood area. She invited me to attend this meeting, claiming it would be an opportunity for dialogue and compromise. Against my better judgment, I decided to attend, hoping to resolve the conflict through peaceful communication. The meeting was held in the community center of a nearby subdivision, and I arrived to find Karen seated at the head of a long table with 6 other board members arranged on either side. The setup felt more like a tribunal than a neighborhood meeting, with Karen clearly positioned as the judge and jury. She had prepared a detailed presentation about property values, community standards, and the importance of uniform enforcement of rules and regulations. Karen began the meeting by presenting what she called evidence of my various violations, complete with photographs and detailed documentation of each alleged infraction. She spoke with the authority of someone who had spent years studying property law, though I suspected her legal knowledge came primarily from internet research and homeowner association forums. The other board members nodded along with her presentation, clearly intimidated by her forceful personality and unwilling to challenge her assertions. When it came time for me to respond, I calmly presented my evidence that the property was not subject to HOA jurisdiction. I had brought copies of the original neighborhood plat maps, the property deed, and even a letter from the county assessor confirming the boundaries of the Willowbrook HOA. But Karen dismissed my documentation with a wave of her hand, claiming that property lines were irrelevant when it came to community standards and neighborhood harmony. The meeting concluded with Karen issuing an ultimatum. She demanded that I either join the HOA voluntarily and pay all outstanding fines, or face legal action to force compliance with community standards. She gave me 30 days to make what she called the right decision for everyone involved. The other board members sat in uncomfortable silence as Karen delivered her threat, clearly aware that she was overstepping her authority but too intimidated to speak up. I left that meeting knowing that Karen would never back down voluntarily. She had invested too much of her ego and reputation in this fight to simply admit she was wrong. But I also knew that she had made a critical error in judgment by escalating the conflict to threats of legal action. Karen was about to learn the hard way that there is a significant difference between HOA politics and actual property law. Over the next few weeks, Karen's harassment intensified to levels that bordered on stalking. She would drive by my house multiple times each day, often stopping to take more photographs or leave additional citations. She contacted my employer, claiming I was involved in a legal dispute that might affect my professional reputation. She even went so far as to post complaints about me on neighborhood social media groups, painting me as a troublemaker who was destroying property values for everyone else. The final straw came when Karen filed a formal lawsuit against me in county court. The legal papers were delivered by a process server on a quiet Sunday morning, and I could see Karen watching from her car across the street as I signed for the documents. She had clearly timed the delivery for maximum dramatic impact, probably hoping to ruin my weekend and demonstrate her power over the situation. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal overreach and misguided confidence. Karen was demanding that I be forced to join the Willowbrook HOA retroactively, pay all outstanding fines plus penalties and interest, and comply with all community standards going forward. She was also seeking damages for what she claimed was my negative impact on neighborhood property values and community harmony. The total amount she was demanding exceeded $20,000, not including her legal fees and court costs. Instead of panicking or rushing to hire an expensive attorney, I decided to take a different approach. I spent the next 2 weeks methodically gathering every piece of documentation related to my property and the HOA boundaries. I visited the county courthouse and obtained certified copies of all relevant records, including the original plat maps from when the neighborhood was first developed. I also researched the history of the Willowbrook HOA, learning when it was established and exactly which properties were included in the original covenant. The most important document I discovered was a detailed survey map prepared by the county assessor that clearly delineated the boundaries of every homeowner association in the area. This map had been updated as recently as the previous year and included GPS coordinates for all boundary markers. My property was clearly located outside the Willowbrook HOA boundaries by more than 200 feet, with a natural creek serving as the official dividing line between HOA and non-HOA properties. I also found records indicating that when the neighborhood was originally developed, my property had been specifically excluded from the HOA covenant because it was part of a separate land parcel that had been sold to a different developer. The original residents of Willowbrook had actually voted to exclude my street from the association to avoid complications with property management and maintenance responsibilities. This exclusion had been properly recorded with the county and had never been challenged or overturned. Armed with this irrefutable evidence, I prepared for what I knew would be a very short court hearing. I had no intention of hiring an attorney or presenting a complex legal argument. The facts were simple and the documentation was clear. Karen had filed a lawsuit demanding jurisdiction over property that was unequivocally outside her authority. She had made the classic mistake of letting her ego override her common sense, and now she was about to pay the price for her overconfidence. The morning of the court hearing arrived with crisp autumn air and clear skies. I arrived at the courthouse early and took a seat in the back of the courtroom, watching as other cases were called and resolved. Karen arrived fashionably late, making a grand entrance with her 3 massive binders and an expensive-looking briefcase. She was accompanied by what appeared to be a paralegal or legal assistant, someone she had probably hired to help her present her case with maximum professional impact. Karen spent several minutes arranging her materials at the plaintiff's table, clearly enjoying the attention she was receiving from other people in the courtroom. She had dressed for the occasion in a sharp business suit and had styled her hair in a way that made her look like she was ready for a television interview. The confidence radiating from her was almost overwhelming, and I could see that she genuinely believed she was about to achieve a historic victory. When our case was called, Karen rose from her seat with theatrical flair and approached the bench with the bearing of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She began her presentation with a detailed explanation of the importance of homeowner associations in maintaining property values and community standards. She spoke eloquently about the social contract that binds neighbors together and the necessity of uniform enforcement of rules and regulations. Karen then launched into a passionate description of my alleged violations, complete with photographs and documentation of each infraction. She painted me as a selfish individual who was destroying the character of the neighborhood through willful noncompliance with reasonable community standards. She claimed that my refusal to join the HOA was setting a dangerous precedent that would encourage other property owners to ignore their civic responsibilities. The judge listened patiently to Karen's presentation, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific violations or timeframes. Karen answered each question with confidence and authority, clearly convinced that she was making an airtight case for forcing me to join the association. She concluded her presentation by demanding that the court order immediate compliance with all HOA rules and payment of all outstanding fines and penalties. When it came time for me to respond, I stood up calmly and approached the bench with a single manila folder containing my documentation. I began by acknowledging Karen's passion for community standards and her dedication to the Willowbrook HOA. But then I explained that there was a fundamental problem with her entire case, a problem that made all of her arguments legally irrelevant. I handed the judge the certified plat map from the county assessor, along with copies of the original neighborhood covenants and my property deed. I explained that my property had been specifically excluded from the HOA when the neighborhood was originally developed, and that this exclusion had been properly recorded with the county. I pointed out that Karen was asking the court to grant her association jurisdiction over property that was clearly outside its legal boundaries. The judge examined the documents carefully, comparing the plat map with the original covenant and my property deed. I watched as his expression shifted from professional interest to mild surprise, and then to something that looked like suppressed irritation. He glanced up at Karen, who was still standing at the plaintiff's table with her confident smile, clearly oblivious to the fact that her entire case had just collapsed. The judge asked Karen if she had reviewed the property boundaries before filing her lawsuit. Karen responded with complete confidence that property lines were irrelevant when it came to community standards and neighborhood harmony. She claimed that her HOA had a moral obligation to enforce standards throughout the extended neighborhood area, regardless of technical legal boundaries. The judge's patience was clearly wearing thin as he explained to Karen that homeowner associations are legal entities with specific jurisdictional boundaries that cannot be ignored or expanded through personal preference. He pointed out that her lawsuit was demanding authority over property that was unequivocally outside her association's jurisdiction, and that this constituted a fundamental legal error that invalidated her entire case. Karen's confident expression began to waver as the judge continued his explanation. She tried to interrupt with arguments about precedent and community standards, but the judge firmly instructed her to remain silent while he delivered his ruling. The courtroom fell completely quiet as everyone realized that something significant was about to happen. The judge declared that the Willowbrook HOA had absolutely no jurisdiction over my property, and that Karen's lawsuit was therefore without merit. He dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning that it could never be refiled on the same grounds. But then he went further, stating that the HOA's pattern of harassment and fraudulent claims could potentially constitute legal violations that might warrant investigation by the appropriate authorities. The judge also noted that my property had been specifically excluded from the HOA covenant through proper legal channels, and that any future attempts to claim jurisdiction over the property would be considered frivolous litigation subject to sanctions. He warned Karen that continued harassment of property owners outside her association's jurisdiction could result in restraining orders and potential criminal charges. Karen stood there in stunned silence as the judge delivered his ruling, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. The confident smile that had been her trademark for months had completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure shock and growing panic. She had clearly never considered the possibility that she might lose the case, let alone lose it so decisively and with such devastating consequences. The judge concluded by noting that homeowner associations serve important functions when they operate within their proper legal boundaries, but that they become destructive forces when they exceed their authority through misguided zealotry. He suggested that the Willowbrook HOA might benefit from reviewing its policies and procedures to ensure that similar legal errors did not occur in the future. As the judge dismissed us from the courtroom, Karen remained frozen at the plaintiff's table, apparently unable to process what had just happened. Her legal assistant was frantically gathering papers and binders, clearly eager to escape the embarrassing situation as quickly as possible. Other people in the courtroom were whispering among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the spectacular nature of Karen's defeat. I walked past Karen's table on my way out of the courtroom, and she finally looked up at me with eyes that showed a mixture of shock, anger, and dawning realization. She had gambled everything on this lawsuit, investing her reputation and credibility in a legal battle that was doomed from the start. Now she faced the prospect of explaining to the HOA board and the entire neighborhood how she had exposed them to potential legal liability through her reckless overreach. The news of Karen's crushing defeat spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Within hours of the court hearing, my phone was ringing with calls from neighbors who had heard about the ruling through the local gossip network. Many of them had been quietly supporting me throughout the conflict, but had been too intimidated by Karen's aggressive tactics to speak up publicly. Now, they felt safe, expressing their relief that her reign of terror had finally come to an end. That evening, I decided to make a statement that would be visible to the entire neighborhood. I visited the local hardware store and purchased materials to create a large wooden sign for my front yard. The sign read in bold letters, "Not part of your HOA, keep walking." I installed it prominently in my front yard, positioned so that it would be clearly visible to anyone walking or driving past my property. The next morning, I noticed Karen standing at her front window, staring at my new sign with an expression of pure fury. But she quickly disappeared from view when she realized I was watching her, and I noticed that she seemed to be avoiding any direct eye contact with me from that point forward. The woman who had once strutted around the neighborhood like she owned every square inch of it now seemed to be hiding in her own house, afraid to show her face in public. Over the following weeks, I learned through neighborhood gossip that Karen was facing serious consequences for her legal overreach. Several HOA board members had called for her resignation, arguing that her reckless lawsuit had exposed the association to potential liability and damaged its reputation in the community. There were also rumors that some homeowners were considering legal action against Karen personally for exceeding her authority and wasting association funds on frivolous litigation. The most satisfying aspect of the entire situation was watching Karen's transformation from an imperious neighborhood dictator to a cautious and subdued individual who seemed to have learned the importance of staying within legal boundaries. She no longer patrolled the neighborhood taking photographs of perceived violations, and she stopped leaving threatening notes on people's cars and doorsteps. The woman who had once terrorized half the neighborhood with her power trips had been completely defanged by a single court ruling. My new sign became something of a local landmark, with neighbors occasionally stopping to take photographs or simply to admire its bold statement of independence. Some people suggested that I should consider selling copies of the sign to other homeowners who were dealing with similar HOA problems, but I preferred to keep it as a unique symbol of my victory over Karen's attempted tyranny. Word of the court case spread far beyond our immediate neighborhood, and I began receiving calls from people in other areas who were dealing with similar conflicts with overzealous homeowner associations. I shared my story and the importance of carefully researching property boundaries and HOA jurisdiction before purchasing a home. Many people were surprised to learn that HOA authority was not unlimited, and that associations could face serious legal consequences for exceeding their proper boundaries. The Willowbrook HOA quietly began the process of reviewing its policies and procedures, clearly hoping to avoid any future legal problems that might arise from Karen's legacy of overreach. New board members were elected with promises to focus on legitimate community issues rather than pursuing vendetta-driven campaigns against individual property owners. The association even issued a formal apology to several residents who had been harassed by Karen during her tenure as president. Karen herself seemed to have learned the hard lesson that reading the fine print and understanding legal boundaries is far more important than passion and determination when it comes to property law. She had discovered that homeowner associations, like all legal entities, have specific limitations on their authority that cannot be ignored or expanded through personal preference. Her spectacular defeat served as a cautionary tale for anyone who might be tempted to exceed their legal authority in pursuit of personal agendas. The aftermath of Karen's legal defeat created ripple effects throughout the entire neighborhood that continued for weeks after the court hearing. I began receiving visits from neighbors who had been quietly suffering under Karen's tyrannical rule for months but had been too afraid to speak up. Mrs. Claston-10 Henderson from 3 houses down confessed that Karen had been threatening her with fines for having a garden gnome in her front yard, even though Mrs. Henderson lived on the same street as me and was also outside the HOA boundaries. She had been living in fear of legal action, completely unaware that Karen had no authority over her property. Another neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, told me that Karen had been demanding he remove his work truck from his driveway because it violated what she called commercial vehicle restrictions. He had been parking his truck in a rented garage space 2 blocks away at significant monthly expense, simply because he believed Karen had the legal authority to enforce such restrictions. When I showed him the county plat map proving his property was outside HOA jurisdiction, he was so relieved he nearly broke down in tears. The stories kept coming from neighbors across the extended area who had been victimized by Karen's campaign of intimidation and harassment. She had been operating like a feudal lord, claiming authority over properties that were clearly outside her jurisdiction and threatening people with legal action they had no reason to fear. Her defeat in court had not only vindicated my position but had also freed dozens of other homeowners from months or even years of unnecessary anxiety and expense. Karen's behavior after the court ruling became increasingly erratic and desperate. She began posting long, rambling messages on neighborhood social media groups, claiming that the judge had been biased and that she was considering an appeal to a higher court. She insisted that property boundaries were irrelevant when it came to maintaining community standards, and that her HOA had a moral obligation to enforce rules throughout the entire area regardless of legal technicalities. These social media posts backfired spectacularly, as they provided documented evidence of Karen's continued harassment and her refusal to accept the court's ruling. Several neighbors began taking screenshots of her posts and comments, building a case for potential restraining orders or harassment charges. Karen seemed completely oblivious to the fact that her online behavior was only making her legal situation worse and providing ammunition for anyone who might want to pursue civil or criminal action against her. The Willowbrook HOA board called an emergency meeting to address what they termed the Karen situation. I learned about this meeting through neighborhood gossip, and while I was not invited to attend, several neighbors who were legitimate HOA members filled me in on the dramatic proceedings. Karen had apparently shown up to the meeting with a stack of legal documents and a prepared speech about fighting the court ruling, but she was immediately shouted down by angry board members who were furious about her reckless behavior. The board members had consulted with their own attorney after the court hearing, and they had learned that Karen's actions had potentially exposed the entire association to significant legal liability. Not only had she filed a frivolous lawsuit that wasted association funds, but her pattern of harassment against non-HOA properties could result in civil rights violations and federal lawsuits. The attorney had recommended that the board immediately distance themselves from Karen's actions and consider removing her from any position of authority. The meeting ended with Karen's resignation as HOA president, though she claimed she was stepping down voluntarily to focus on her appeal efforts. The board members were clearly relieved to be rid of her, and they began the process of damage control that would take months to complete. They sent formal letters to all the homeowners Karen had harassed, apologizing for her behavior and clarifying that the HOA had no authority over properties outside its boundaries. Meanwhile, I decided to document the entire experience by creating a detailed timeline of Karen's harassment campaign and the eventual court victory. I gathered all the citations she had left on my property, the threatening letters she had sent, and the photographs she had taken during her surveillance activities. I also obtained a copy of the court transcript from the hearing, which made for fascinating reading and clearly showed the judge's growing impatience with Karen's legal theories. This documentation proved valuable when I was contacted by a local newspaper reporter who was writing a story about HOA overreach and property rights. The reporter was particularly interested in the legal aspects of the case and the implications for other homeowners who might be facing similar situations. I provided her with copies of all my documentation, including the county plat map that had been the key to my victory. The newspaper article was published a few weeks later under the headline HOA President Learns Hard Lesson About Property Boundaries. The story included a detailed account of Karen's harassment campaign, the court hearing, and the legal principles involved in the case. It also featured quotes from several neighbors who had been affected by Karen's overreach and expert commentary from a property law attorney about the importance of understanding HOA jurisdiction. Karen was reportedly furious about the newspaper article, claiming that it was biased and defamatory. She threatened to sue the newspaper for damages to her reputation, but her threats were not taken seriously by anyone who understood the legal concept of truth as a defense to defamation claims. The article had been carefully fact-checked and based on documented evidence, court records, and interviews with multiple witnesses. The publicity from the newspaper article led to additional consequences for Karen that she had not anticipated. Her employer, a local real estate company, began receiving calls from potential clients who were concerned about working with someone who had been involved in such a high-profile legal defeat. The real estate industry depends heavily on reputation and trust, and Karen's public humiliation was damaging her professional credibility in ways that extended far beyond the neighborhood conflict. I also learned that Karen was facing potential disciplinary action from the state real estate licensing board. Several complaints had been filed against her by neighbors who felt that her harassment campaign had violated professional standards and ethical requirements. The licensing board takes such complaints seriously, particularly when they involve legal disputes and documented patterns of harassment. The ripple effects of Karen's defeat continued to spread throughout the broader community as word of the case reached other neighborhoods dealing with similar HOA conflicts. I began receiving calls from homeowners in other areas who were facing harassment from overzealous association boards, and I was able to provide them with guidance about researching property boundaries and understanding their legal rights. One particularly memorable call came from a woman named Susan, who lived in a subdivision about 20 miles away. She had been battling her HOA for 2 years over a dispute about the color of her front door, and the association had threatened to place a lien on her property if she did not comply with their demands. After hearing about my case, Susan decided to research her own property boundaries and discovered that her home had been improperly included in the HOA covenant due to a surveying error that had never been corrected. Susan used the same approach I had taken, gathering certified documents from the county and presenting them to her HOA board. When the board refused to acknowledge their error, Susan took them to court, using my case as a precedent. She won a decisive victory that not only freed her from HOA jurisdiction, but also resulted in the association having to pay her legal fees and damages for the harassment she had endured. These success stories became a source of personal satisfaction that extended far beyond my own victory over Karen. It was gratifying to know that my willingness to stand up to her bullying behavior had created a template that other homeowners could use to protect their own property rights. The case had established important legal precedents about HOA jurisdiction and the consequences of exceeding proper authority. As autumn turned to winter, Karen's presence in the neighborhood became increasingly minimal. She seemed to spend most of her time indoors, avoiding the public spaces where she might encounter neighbors who knew about her legal defeat. When she did venture outside, she moved quickly and avoided eye contact with anyone who might recognize her from the newspaper article or neighborhood gossip. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The woman who had once strutted around the neighborhood like she owned every square inch of it now seemed to shrink into herself whenever she appeared in public. Her defeat had not only stripped away her imagined authority, but had also revealed the fundamental insecurity and need for control that had driven her harassment campaign in the first place. The new HOA board that replaced Karen took a dramatically different approach to community relations. They focused on legitimate issues within their actual boundaries, such as maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood social events. They made it clear that they had no interest in pursuing conflicts with non-HOA properties, and that they would strictly adhere to their legal limitations in all future actions. This change in leadership created a much more peaceful atmosphere throughout the entire area. Neighbors who had been living in fear of Karen's arbitrary enforcement actions began to relax and enjoy their properties again. The constant tension that had characterized the neighborhood during Karen's reign of terror gradually dissipated, replaced by a sense of community cooperation and mutual respect. The entire experience reinforced my belief that knowledge and careful preparation are the most powerful tools available to anyone facing legal challenges. Karen had been so confident in her position that she had never bothered to verify the basic facts underlying her case. She had assumed that her authority as HOA president was unlimited, and that her determination alone would be sufficient to achieve victory in court. Her crushing defeat demonstrated the importance of doing homework and understanding the law before making legal threats or filing lawsuits. From that day forward, whenever I looked at my sign in the front yard, I was reminded of the importance of standing up for property rights and refusing to be intimidated by people who exceed their legal authority. Karen had learned that picking fights with people who read the fine print and understand their rights is a recipe for disaster, and her humiliating defeat would serve as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to follow in her footsteps.